Chapter 19 of the Alps, the Danube, and the Near East. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Betty B. Breadlands of the Danube. The car was a Fiat manufactured in Italy, sold in Austria, owned in Hungary, and driven by a Magyar daredevil, a descendant of the invaders that overran this Danube basin more than 1,000 years ago. It was a 7-passenger, 35-horsepower machine, which could easily be speeded up to 50 miles an hour, and the chauffeur fairly burned the road as we traveled. We left Budapest in the early morning, crossing the suspension bridge to the south side of the river, flying by factory buildings, and then shooting out into the country. We followed the river past the island where the city plans to build municipal docks, and thence drove on into the grain lands of the Danube. The white macadamized roads were lined with fruit trees, with boys perched here and there in the branches, and beyond them, extending as far as the eye could see, were the many-colored crops, fields of rye, oats, barley, wheat, sugar beets, and alfalfa in different shades of green were now and then bordered by poppies as red as fresh blood. There was nothing to obstruct the view, no fences, no barns, no houses, and no haystacks. Nature alone was the architect, and there popped into my mind the old saying, "God made the country, and man made the town." For miles we rode through patches no bigger than a parlor rug, and strips of grass or grain 10, 15, or 20 feet wide and many hundred feet long. How the peasants know their own boundaries is hard to understand, but they till these ribbon-like tracts year after year, going out from their villages at dawn to work in the fields, and returning home from them when the sun sets. When we came to the estates of some of the big landholders, the fields were enormous. The usual area devoted to one crop was 50 acres. Sometimes we passed through vineyards where the hills were covered with thousands of stakes as high as my waist, each of which supported a grapevine as carefully tended as a rose bush in your garden. The vines of Hungary are cut down to the ground year after year, and as the plants grow up again they are tied to stakes with straw so as not to injure the stems. They are thoroughly sprayed, and the soil between the rows is kept free of weeds. When the fruit ripens it is made into wine, most of the vineyards having their own wine presses. Hungary is one of the great wine-making countries of Europe, and its Tokay and other vintages are known everywhere. But the import restrictions of Hungary's neighbors are now so stringent that the foreign market has been largely cut off, and out in the country one can buy a quart of delicious wine for a nickel. During my 200-mile ride I visited the grape-growing region about Lake Balaton, the largest lake in Central Europe and 100 miles from Budapest. The hills surrounding it are mostly covered with vineyards and forests, but in places there are fields of grain crops sloping down to the water. I looked across vast stretches of wheat, oats, and rye, pale yellow or the color of gold, to the silvery sheet of the water beyond. The lake, which is 50 miles long and from 2 to 9 miles wide, is a beautiful body of water, light green in color and very deep. It swarms with fine fish, among which are perch, carp, pike, and shad, and also the fogas, which is almost as sweet as the shad, but which seems to have only one bone up the back. Lake Balaton is the great resort of the Hungarians. Many rich men have splendid houses and beautiful gardens on its shores, and the region is sometimes called the Riviera of Central Europe. There are several large hotels, and I visited a big sanatorium for tubercular patients who come here to get the benefit of the air from the pines and the lake. It was here, at Lake Balaton, that Charles, the last Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, was interned by his people. Banished to Switzerland, he tried twice to come back and regain his throne. When he came first, he was favored by the higher clergy and the aristocracy, but Admiral Horthy, the regent, would not give up his job without an order from the National Assembly. Moreover, the Allies had said that no Habsburg should reign again in Hungary, so the officials advised Charles to leave, and he went back to Switzerland. That was in the spring. In the following October he got a Swiss airplane, took his Empress Zita with him, and flew back to Hungary. Here he was met by a small army of royalists, but the countries of the little Entente reinforced their soldiers on Hungary's borders with 3 divisions, and the king's troops were defeated with a loss of several hundred killed and wounded. A little later the government asked Charles to abdicate the throne and surrender himself to the British authorities. He did so and was put on a British gunboat in the Danube and taken to Funchal on the island of Madeira, where he died. His young son, Prince Otto, who is now a guest of his cousin, Alfonso of Spain, is the legitimate successor to the throne of the Habsburgs. From Lake Balaton I drove across country to visit the estate of Count Bathyany. Like other members of the Hungarian nobility, the Count is highly educated, a good horseman, and an expert farmer. He can trace his ancestry back to the earliest days of Magyar history and lives in a mansion 7 centuries old. During the past 200 years, 6 successive generations of his family have held the estate. When I met him in his garden at the back of the mansion, he looked, in his white flannels, as if he had just stepped out of a bandbox. We first walked through the gardens, which covered several acres. The rose garden was gay with arbor after arbor of crimson ramblers, and other roses of different hues made bowers of gorgeous color. There were also dwarf and other choice flowers of every description. Adjoining the roses was a sunken Italian garden paved with blocks of snowy marble, with flowers and vines growing between the stones so as to form a great coverlet of white embroidered with green vines and brilliant verbenas, geraniums, and other plants, the names of which I do not know. We picked our way over the flags and walked through the wide colonnades around the mansion to its central court. Here we looked out over a plaza covering an acre, laid in mosaic patterns of red and white stones, and through long avenues of trees trimmed to form vistas down which we gazed upon the Count's domain. And such a domain! It is a principality. It contains 10,000 acres divided into 10 great farms of 1,000 acres each, all under the highest cultivation, and all now ripe with the harvest. Count Bathyany ordered his car, and we drove together over one of the farms. Each has its manager, and the methods of administration and cultivation are the same in all. There are 500 workers regularly employed upon the estate. In addition to these, there are hundreds of men and women who come from their villages in April and stay until the crops are gathered and the fall planting is done. Everything is managed after the most approved business methods, and the property pays big dividends. For instance, the land is so tilled that the soil is kept rich while yielding annual crops far above those of equally good land in our country. I looked at one rye field where half the grain was yet to be cut. The sheaves had been stacked up in piles, and the section already reaped was being plowed by oxen. The Count told me it paid him to have the plow follow the reapers. The spots on which the shocks stand are the only parts of the field left untouched until fall, when the whole is then turned over again with steam plows. Before it is planted again, the earth will be as finely pulverized as that for a flower bed. We then drove past a tract of sugar beets and great plots of rye, barley, and turnips. Each farm, the Count told me, is divided into fields of 50 acres each. He showed me one wheat field where the stalks were bent over by the heavily loaded heads. As I looked at it, I saw that the yellow grain was in big patches of different hues and tints. I asked the reason for this. The owner replied that there were 24 different kinds of wheat in the field, sown in blocks of about 2 acres to each kind, and that he was testing the varieties to find which was best adapted to the soil. He expects the whole field to produce about 2,000 bushels or 40 bushels per acre. Compare that with our average of 13 or 14 bushels to the acre. Count Bathyany is a plant breeder whose seed grain is sold throughout both Austria and Hungary. The estate supports a variety of industries. We passed factories making alcohol, sugar, and other things so as to use as far as possible the raw materials grown here. There are nurseries supplying trees, plants, and flowers to a great part of Central Europe. There are 100 acres of vineyards and big truck gardens, the products of which are shipped by train daily to Budapest and other cities. Even more interesting, however, are the fish ponds, where Count Bathyny raises carp for Berlin, Vienna, and other European capitals. He has one pond of 50 acres on the farm I have described, and on his son's estate, not far away, there are fish ponds covering altogether 350 acres. The fish are caught when just right for the market and shipped alive in cars fitted with water tanks. In our ride, we crossed the steam railroads on each side of the estate and went over the light railways built on the property. It was now almost sunset, but everywhere gangs of women and men were still working. I asked the Count what wages he paid. He replied that the men got 7 or 8 cents a day, and the women a cent or less. These are the wages of the floating laborers that work through the summer. In addition, they are given their food and sleep in barracks provided for them. During the rush periods, their hours are from dawn until dark. Each of the year-round employees living on the estate is given a plot of 1 or 2 acres of ground and allowed time to farm it. These workers also get rations and other supplies besides regular wages, which are so small that our laborers would scorn them. I visited the quarters of these permanent employees. They were long, high, one-story, barrack-like buildings with doors and windows looking out on gardens in front and with small windows at the back. I asked the owner how many rooms were allowed to a family. He replied that he was compelled by law to give each family a storeroom, a living room, and a kitchen, but that in former times it was possible to crowd 2 or 3 families into one room. For generations, Hungary has been feeding some of the neighboring nations, and I understand that, notwithstanding its shrunken area, it will still have tens of millions of bushels of wheat for export every year. What I have seen of the grain fields of the basin, the wheat barges on the rivers, and the flour mills of the city convinces me of the importance of Hungary as the breadbasket of Central Europe. Budapest is the Minneapolis of the continent. It lies on both sides of the Danube, just as our flower city lies on both sides of the Mississippi. Old Buda on the bluff and Newer Pest on the lowlands are joined by bridges, just as are Old St. Anthony and Young Minneapolis, and both the Hungarian and the Minnesota cities are noted for their flour mills. At harvest time, the Danube is filled with barges of wheat moving up to the mills. When they tie up at the docks, the grain is sucked through pipes to the top floors of the grain elevators and moved about on belt conveyors. In the mills, endless belts carry the bags of flour and drop them into the waiting barges. Even now, Budapest claims that it ranks next to Minneapolis among the flour milling centers of the world. Its annual output is about half that of the Minnesota city, and plans had been made to triple the production when the war came and stopped them. Last week I visited what I am told is the biggest single flour mill on earth. It is situated within a stone's throw of the Danube, from which one great conveyor brings up the grain while another carries down the sacks of flour. The building is 5 stories tall, and adjoining it are 2 elevators, one for grain and the other for flour. All its machines are automatic, and the number of laborers is surprisingly few. I went through room after room in which only 2 or 3 men were to be seen. Just as in our own modern mills, the grain drops by gravity from process to process. The flour goes up and down on its way to the boats or the cars without being touched, and cold is automatically fed to the furnaces. I have been through the big mills of Minneapolis. They are wonderful in their construction, but they have not the finish and the extraordinary cleanliness of the Budapester. As far back as 1890, Budapest was manufacturing 5,000,000 barrels of flour every year, while at that time Minneapolis was making only 1,000,000 more. There are now in the capital a great number of flour mills equipped with modern machinery and paying big dividends. There are other mills scattered throughout the basin of the Danube. In what was the old Hungary there are more than 20,000 flour mills in operation, most of which are small establishments run by water power and supplying local markets. End of section 19.